Good afternoon. It's June 28th, 2019. My name is Matthew Ogden, and you're watching a strategic webcast from LaRouchePAC.com. I'm joined here today by Mr. Paul Gallagher of Executive Intelligence Review. Thank you, Paul. Let me just start our broadcast here today with a headline. On your screen, you'll see an article that was published by Reuters this past Monday, June 24th. The headline reads, "Russia warns of repeat of 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis." The article quotes Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov warning that the United States and Russia are on the verge of a nuclear standoff comparable to no other point in history than that of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Let me just read you the first few lines of this article. Dateline, Moscow. The U.S. deployment of land-based missile systems near Russia's borders could lead to a standoff comparable to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov was quoted as saying on Monday. Russia has been fiercely critical of U.S. plans to deploy missile systems in Eastern Europe and of Washington's withdrawal from the INF Arms Control Treaty. It goes on to say, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962 when the Soviet Union responded to a U.S. missile deployment in Turkey by sending ballistic missiles to Cuba, sparking a standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Quote, if things get as far as an actual deployment on the ground of these sorts of systems, then the situation won't just get more complicated, it will escalate right to the limit, RIA news agency quoted Ryabkov as saying. Finally, quote, we could find ourselves in a situation where we have a rocket crisis close not just to the crisis of the 1980s, but close to the Caribbean crisis, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, Ryabkov said. Now, over the course of this week, we've heard also Russian President Vladimir Putin make similar warnings of the rapidly approaching danger of the actual outbreak of thermonuclear war. Many people alive today did live through the terror of those events during those 13 days in October of 1962, when the world teetered at the brink of thermonuclear war, but many alive today did not. Let me just play for you a short excerpt from actual news coverage from that time in October of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, when the entire population of the United States was convinced with just cause that full-scale nuclear war could indeed break out at any moment.
I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation. This resolution calls, as an interim measure under Article 40 of the Charter, for the immediate dismantling and withdrawal from Cuba of all missile and other offensive weapons. It urgently recommends that the United States and the Soviet Union confer promptly on measures to remove the existing threat to the security of the Western Hemisphere and the peace of the world, and to report thereon to the Security Council.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet. Literally thousands of pictures can be made on each flight by these planes, and they are studied by photo interpreters who are capable of analyzing details that an untrained eye would miss. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. The goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
That was 1962. But now, in 2019, as Ryabkov and others have warned, we find ourselves on the verge of a crisis of similar magnitude, if not far worse. A statement was released earlier this week by LaRouchePAC, which is now circulating extensively in Washington, D.C. and nationally, titled, "When Future Historians Review This Week, Will They See a Turning Point or a Descent on the Road to Hell?" You can see that on your screen right now. This statement begins with the following warning from Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She says, quote, "Who does not wake up and know that we are on the verge of World War III? Such a person is not in the real world. We are closer to World War III than at any time, I would say, in the entire post-war period." Now, the meetings between President Trump and President Putin at the G20 summit in Osaka, Japan, as well as between Trump and President Xi, which are ongoing as we speak. These meetings may turn out to be two of the most crucial meetings ever held among heads of state. On Monday, as we reported, Reuters had an article that a senior Russian official, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, had raised a nightmare scenario of the possible deployment of U.S. missiles near Russian borders, turning into a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The statement goes on to say, "Most who lived through that terrifying event never would have imagined that it would or even could ever happen again. What if, however, we are now sleepwalking, as in 1914, as in 1939, into a global war, which would this time be thermonuclear extinction? Why is the world closer now to self-extinction than it was in 1962? And perhaps the even more relevant question is, what must be done to prevent this? So this is why I've asked Paul Gallagher to join us here today. Many of our viewers will have seen the feature documentary, which was published last week by LaRouchePAC, called The Case for the Exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. And if you've not, we insist that you view that documentary urgently. This is not a question of past history. This is not a question of righting past wrongs, but rather it's essential to understanding how we reach this point today, why Lyndon LaRouche's ideas remain the solution by which the current crisis can be resolved. So to understand the steps that must be taken this weekend by Presidents Trump, President Xi, President Putin, you must understand the history of the fight that Lyndon LaRouche led during the years 1977 through 1987 for what became known as the SDI, what President Reagan termed the Strategic Defense Initiative. So to help us better understand that history, we're joined by Paul Gallagher, who worked alongside Lyndon LaRouche for that. But before I introduce Paul, let me play for you just a short piece of archival footage from a broadcast the day immediately following President Ronald Reagan's announcement of the SDI in 1983. This clip from Dan Rather, CBS Evening News, is from March 24th, 1984.
Dan Rather reporting tonight from Washington. President Reagan today followed up last night's defense policy speech. He gave the go-ahead to develop a space-age system designed to neutralize an enemy nuclear missile attack.
The space weapons of science fiction and video games moved out of the fantasy world with President Reagan's announcement of a crash program to develop space-age missile defenses. Mr. Reagan wants a national scientific effort to support work already underway in government labs into a dizzying variety of futuristic ray guns using lasers, beams, microwaves, X-rays, and other exotic technologies.
Our nations will have the capability to defend themselves without simply threatening to retaliate and completely destroy the population of the other country. We can move into a period of mutually assured survival when we are not held hostage ourselves as the only deterrent to war.
So as you can see, Paul Gallagher, who's joining us here today, was the head of the Fusion Energy Foundation at that time. He was the person whom all the leading broadcast television networks sought out as the expert on what President Reagan had just announced as the SDI, precisely because LaRouche and his organization were universally recognized as having been the leading proponents and crafters of what Reagan had just announced. So, Paul, what is the urgent relevance of this history for the situation today?
Well, thanks, Matt. I want to give a rough timeline of the actions that Lyndon LaRouche took between 1977 and 1987 in order to make the Strategic Defense Initiative a force which in fact did change the world, and what his motivation, what the objectives were that he was going for, both in terms of military doctrine, changing the military doctrine of the superpowers to one of assured survival, and also creating a technological industrial revolution worldwide based on these new technologies that the media were sort of making light of there. But as he said, laser and relativistic beam technologies, which should at that time already have been being used in industry in the advanced sector, but were not, were overdue, to bring them into a technological and industrial revolution which would spread through capital exports to the developing countries and would enable them to develop rapidly. And then third, to solve a crisis of intermediate nuclear force missiles short, relatively intermediate range missiles that could reach their intended target very quickly before the targeted nation really could react to bring about the banning of those, which did occur in 1987. I'd like to refer first to the fact, and I think it's an important one, that as we saw the warning in the statement there that Matt had on the screen, that we are closer to World War III than potentially at any time in the post-war period. In the Democratic debate on Wednesday night, the first of the two Democratic debates this week, candidate Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman from Hawaii, made essentially that statement, and in fact she made it more than once and made it the theme of her intervention in that debate, that the constant war, the practice of perpetual wars, regime change wars, in which the last three administrations now have been entangled, that has led us to the shadow, literally, of thermonuclear war. So this is clearly, people got a shock just 2 weeks ago when the New York Times blatantly announced, and they made it clear in their article, with the collusion of the National Security Council itself, announced on their own front page that the United States was conducting cyber warfare against the electricity grid and possibly other infrastructure of Russia. And in fact, claimed that the United States had placed, in effect, a cyber bomb inside the electricity grid of Russia, or one or more of grids in Russia, and therefore had the potential of doing what is really, in terms of two superpowers, is existential damage. The electricity grid obviously has a great deal to do with the ability of a superpower to defend itself, and therefore a large-scale attack, such as the Times was bragging the United States had prepared, cyber attack on the Russian electricity grid would be in itself a cause of war, an act of war of one superpower on another. That was a shock. President Trump, who has been constantly under unrelenting propaganda and scandal pressure to confront Russia, to in every way stage confrontations with Russia, President Trump immediately denounced that New York Times revelation as a fraud and as, in fact, as he said, treason, because it was directly worsening the strategic situation of the United States in a situation where the public reading it and others reading it could not determine whether the revelation was true or not. And in fact, treason because the article bragged that the Congress had authorized this, that the National Security Council had authorized this, and that the president had not been told, and that the president had been kept out of the loop because he might have countermanded it. So I think treason was not too hard a word for him to use. That shocked those who understood the situation when they read that into realizing that we are, in fact, in a war situation. What Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov was referring to in his statement goes right back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as he indicated. That is, when you have short-range or intermediate-range nuclear-equipped missiles being moved close to the boundaries of the other nuclear superpower, then you are putting it in a position where it has no time to respond, and in fact, where at the very first indication that it thinks it has, that something may be going on with those missiles, it more or less has to launch its own. And then you are in nuclear war. We had in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis a truly terrifying 2 weeks, somewhat more than 2 weeks. 75% of all U.S. strategic bombers were in the air at all times in those 2 weeks, ready to fly to their targets and release their nuclear bombs. The Strategic Air Command was on the level of readiness immediately before the level which indicates nuclear war is starting. And that remained the case for 2 weeks. And it was clear enough that, as you indicated, many, many, many millions of people around the world thought that human civilization was coming to an end at that time. The reason was the placing of intermediate range nuclear-equipped missiles very close to the Soviet Union at that time in Turkey. Actually, they began to be deployed first at the demand of the United Kingdom. And they were first deployed in the United Kingdom and in Italy. And then very shortly after that, a battalion of Jupiter missiles, as they were called, was put into Turkey right at the border of the Soviet Union at that time. Highly accurate missiles. They were 4 times more accurate than any other missiles that had been produced up to that time, ballistic missiles. And they could be prepared for firing within less than 15 minutes. They were just a few minutes from their targets. The Soviet Union at that time possessed 30 nuclear-equipped ICBMs. The United States had placed 15 Jupiter missiles in Turkey. That was targeting more than half of the entire nuclear deterrent of Russia. That was putting everything on a hair trigger. The Soviet Union tried to balance that by the placing of missiles into Cuba, at the same time getting a new ally by supposedly defending it against the United States. You had the 2 elements in the crisis which are most dangerous. You had intermediate range nuclear missiles being deployed very, very near the border of the other superpower, and you had a regime change war going on at the same time, exactly of the kind that Congresswoman Gabbard was denouncing the other night. You had Operation Mongoose, a very heavily funded effort on the part of the United States to eliminate the Cuban government, including assassinating Fidel Castro and other leaders of that government. That operation was spending $50 million a year in an attempt to get rid of the Castro government. The combination of the INF missiles, the intermediate nuclear missiles, and that regime change crisis over Cuba led to the very doorstep of the end of human civilization in the second half of October of 1962. In between this crisis we face now, which the Russian minister indicated, again, you have nuclear-capable missiles very close to the border of the Soviet Union, the border of Russia, in Poland and Romania. As those are upgraded to stage 3 and stage 4 of those ABM systems, they become capable, and the Russians have said this publicly, they become capable of interfering with Russia's ability to respond to a nuclear strike. Therefore, it has no deterrent under those circumstances and is in a situation where it has to act preemptively instead of being able to rely on its ability to retaliate as the deterrent factor. They've said that those ABM systems in Poland, Romania, now in South Korea and in Japan, that those at their 3rd and 4th stages of development will be able to interfere with Russia's ability to launch a second strike. So you have that situation combined with very intense situation of multiple wars in South Asia going on at the same time, and the threat of another one coming from underneath President Trump in his administration, the threat of another one with Iran. And you have at the same time both powers now having withdrawn from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. So the situation is very, very dangerous again. In between, in 1980, there was the Euro Missiles Crisis, which again brought the world within the immediate shadow of a potential thermonuclear exchange between the superpowers. This was again known to millions. There were demonstrations which literally involved millions of people, particularly all across Europe in 1981, 1982. They started at the end of 1980 when it became clear that there was a placement of missiles in Russia, SS-20s, and a corresponding placement of missiles in Western Europe. So this then created a situation into which Lyndon LaRouche was already intervening. And when we talk about the need to exonerate LaRouche, it's this kind of intervention which not only indicates why, but also indicates why he was prosecuted in the first place. Beginning in 1977, already Lyndon LaRouche had commissioned and his organization had distributed a mass circulation pamphlet, The Science Behind the Sputnik of the 70s, which drew on the very first reports of work being done in Russia, in the Soviet Union, on beams, what are called relativistic beams, laser beams, particle beams, various tuned laser beams, capable of being propagated over long distances at the speed of light and capable, under development, of damaging and destroying thermonuclear missiles. Immediately, LaRouche put this pamphlet out and immediately explained in the pamphlet both the potential change in the nuclear doctrine of mutually assured survival, or rather to mutually assured survival from mutually assured destruction, and at the same time began to explain in a mass pamphlet the potential industrial revolution involved in these technologies. Then immediately in the course of the 1980 presidential campaign, Lyndon LaRouche and President Reagan had an encounter and a discussion on the dais of one of the debates in New Hampshire, in which LaRouche briefly introduced the idea both that the development of these new technologies against nuclear missiles would not violate the ABM Treaty of 1972. They would require that treaty be renegotiated, and also that this was potentially something which could be developed simultaneously by the United States and the Soviet Union, and therefore be a kind of a joint competition and collaboration at the same time in ending mutually assured destruction. This led to quite a number of meetings and discussions between representatives of LaRouche and representatives of the incoming Reagan administration and the administration after it took office. And in December 1981, LaRouche was requested by the administration to develop what's called a back channel with the Soviet leadership. That is, to develop an unknown, secretly held discussions, regular discussions through a channel in the Soviet embassy of that time in order to discuss the possibility that Reagan might adopt a doctrine of mutually assured survival and an effort to develop the technologies to make that possible.
We have a short video clip. You can see just the next of the front of the Soviet embassy at that time. This is what it looked like in 1982.
This was actually established by LaRouche successfully in February of 1982, 2 months after he was requested to do this by the Reagan administration. And the meetings took place regularly for somewhat over a year, roughly every 6 weeks between LaRouche and a Soviet representative. Discussing this, he was then immediately reporting back in every case after that to representatives of the National Security Council of the Reagan administration, and minutes were taken and notes to file were filed so that it was possible for everyone in the administration to follow the progress of this back channel discussion. It's interesting that a German military intelligence official about 10 years later had the following to say about that back channel. He was, I thought I had it here. It's worth noting. This was General Scherer, Paul Albert Scherer. He was speaking at the National Press Club in Washington, and he said, in the spring of 1982, here in the Soviet embassy, there were very important secret talks that were held. The question was, did the United States and the Soviet Union wish jointly to develop an anti-ballistic missile defense that would have made nuclear war impossible? Then in August, you had this very sharp Soviet rejection of the idea. I have discussed this very thoroughly with the developer, the originator of this idea, who is the scientific, technological, strategic expert Lyndon LaRouche. This was General Paul Albert Scherer, who was had been the head of German military intelligence in the relevant period. So that back channel was established. Unfortunately, at the same time, a different kind of back channel into the Reagan administration began to be established against LaRouche. This began with a British letter, letter of the British government to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, asking that LaRouche be investigated as possibly an agent of the Soviet Union. And it then led to a letter to FBI Director William Webster from Henry Kissinger, which I think is the one you see on your screen here. That letter asked that LaRouche be investigated under the guidelines or otherwise, as Kissinger put it, that is legally or otherwise, that an investigation of LaRouche be started as a potential agent of foreign influence. At the same time, the RAND Corporation and others in collaboration with the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board published their own secret intelligence assessment and started circulating it in the Reagan administration. It was called Soviet Capabilities for Strategic Nuclear Conflict, 1982-1992. This was what was used by Reagan in the first 25 minutes of his speech, in which the last 5 minutes shook the world. The last 5 minutes were the announcement of the new strategic anti-ballistic missile defense doctrine, which could lead to mutually assured survival. But the report that Kissinger and others had been circulating was a report calling strictly for a confrontation, a showdown with the Soviet Union. LaRouche pursued this. As of the beginning of 1983, he gave a speech in early 1983, January 1st actually, in which he said, within the next 90 days, we must see the Reagan administration adopt the new strategic doctrine of anti-missile defense. That was 83 days before President Reagan did, in fact, make that speech on March 23rd of 1983, in which he finished the speech by announcing the new doctrine. Now, at that point, there was already quite a mobilization against LaRouche, particularly on the Democratic Party side, but also attacks on him beginning to appear in certain Soviet publications as being the man behind, the intellectual author of the new doctrine that Reagan had announced. And at this point, in April of 1983, Lyndon LaRouche gave a speech to a large conference in Washington, D.C., a conference attended by 700 or 800 people, in which it was called Beam the Bomb. And in that speech, he made very clear what the potential of this new doctrine was that the Reagan administration had started to adopt, both in terms of assuring against nuclear war and providing for a durable peace, and also in terms of a technological industrial revolution, both in the advanced sector and also for the benefit of the developing countries. This would be a durable peace as opposed to what had happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the nuclear war was averted, the missiles were withdrawn from Turkey and from Cuba, the intermediate range missiles, and a hotline was established, which people became familiar with later on, and the very first negotiations began over nuclear arms control, but there was not the establishment of durable peace as a result of the factors of war actually having been removed. That had not happened. This is what LaRouche was talking about here in this presentation.
Now, on the U.S. side, I'm certain that the program I'm projecting will cause the greatest economic boom in world history in the United States. What academician Velikov wrote in the indicated issue of the Economic Gazette is only a hint of the sweeping revolution in modern science, as well as in agriculture and other fields, which will be hitting our economy in the civilian sector by 1985, and even perhaps as early as 1984. By 1984, I mean that there are existing laser technologies which we are not using and we should be using in the U.S. economy. But because of our habits of thinking, we've been throwing them off. And when the word gets around that the laser is the thing to have, you're going to have the purchasing agent saying we need a laser for the factory. And they say, well, what are we going to do with it? Well, somebody else will figure that out, but let's have one. And so suddenly there will be a boom in the laser industry. And in the way things usually happen, somebody will make the things work, and it will be a benefit for reasons that academician Velikov said. And you see, during the latter part of this decade, we'll begin to get significant spin-offs, if we're determined to do so, in the civilian sector of the economy from new developments coming out of the military sector. And if I have any influence on it, that will happen very rapidly. As I said, I predict that this spending of $1 trillion won't cost the U.S. economy a penny. The increase in the average level of income per person will be of a much greater amount as a result of the technological spin-offs than we spend per person for the program. Now, it's true that military spending as such is economic waste. You can't eat it. I hope you don't try to wear it. And so what is waste? But let's look at waste in terms of laboratory terms. Let's imagine that military spending is nothing but a gigantic laboratory. And what comes out the back end of that laboratory, as far as material, is scrap, which is what military goods are as far as an economy is concerned. And if you use them too freely, they turn the economy into scrap. But think of that as a laboratory, and think of the technologies coming out of the laboratory coming into the economy. So think of the $1 trillion as being spent as a laboratory expense, albeit not in the most efficient way, but as a laboratory expense, and then think of its effect on the economy. That it's not unrealistic to expect that as a result of this program, the gross output, tangible output per capita in the U.S. economy will increase by between 2 and 3 times within the next 15 years. It's very simple. All we have to do, first of all, to get a very substantial increase in the economy is to reverse the post-55 trends. We have gone from, we had 55% of the labor force in 1929, as we entered the Great Depression, was employed either in production of tangible goods or in transportation of goods. In 1946, at the beginning of the post-war civilian economy, we're employing 62% of the labor force either in producing tangible goods or in transporting them. Today we're employing a shrinking 28% or less. If we simply reverse that trend through reindustrialization, we will automatically, very easily, double the total output of the economy in the next 15 years. Now, if we compare the case of NASA's research and development effect on the economy back during the early 1960s. We compare that, it is extremely modest to say that the overall increase per year in productivity of the U.S. labor force over the next 15 years will grow at about 5% per year. That's an extremely modest estimate. It could go up to as high as 10%, for reasons I'll indicate. Now, from Moscow, this may look a little different. I would estimate, on the basis of what I know of the capabilities, the scale of Soviet work and the capabilities of Soviet scientists, that over the next 4 to 5 years, the Soviet Union can probably approximately match anything we can do in this area, in the military sector. The question is, can they enjoy the same rate of economic growth in the economy that we can as a result of the civilian economy spin-offs? Thus, can they continue to afford the expenditure at the level we can after 1987, 88, 86? Huh? Look what we've done to many countries around the world. We have destroyed morality, the most elementary morality. We've destroyed it with cultural pessimism by denying the right to life of every human being, the right to development of every human being, the opportunity to live a fruitful life for every human being. We've said, get your kicks, kid. You might run out. The world might run out tomorrow. Get your pleasure now. That's all that counts. So we've lost the essential moral basis on which to make the kinds of policy decisions we need to survive. By going back and forcing ourselves to do what we should have done anyway, to commit ourselves to technological progress, we'll force back cultural optimism. And the two superpowers have any brains, we'll force ourselves to live together on the same planet. How should we do that? How shall the two superpowers negotiate? Before coming to the final point here tonight, just take this point in itself. I would say that the counselor for the two superpowers in the coming negotiations would be Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Why? She probably is the best statesperson alive today. We've met her once. I've had correspondence with her. I know people around her. But that's not why. That's a necessary included qualification. But she happens to be the leader of 101 nations, the non-aligned nations group. 101 nations who also live on this planet and who would like to continue to live, and whose destiny is very much determined by the conduct of the two superpowers. The only way the two superpowers can live on this planet together is by living together with these 101 nations and others. And that's the only way, by finding a common cause, by making the voice of the non-aligned people who aspire to technological progress, who wish the benefits of this new technology. It's the only way we're going to make it.
Now, that is the idea that leads to durable peace. That's what LaRouche was fighting for throughout the period in which the SDI was being fought over. He came under extraordinary simultaneous attack by the media in the United States, including major national media, the national networks, the Washington Post and New York Times, special programs on special national network programs attacking him, simultaneously being attacked by the major government media in the Soviet Union as the intellectual author of this awful new doctrine. Once they had decided that they would fight it, that they would try to get Reagan to give it up. He would not give it up. To make a long story short, in the Reykjavik Summit in 1986, in which literally while that summit was going on, LaRouche's offices were raided by the FBI and other law enforcement. Many of his associates were arrested and indicted. The process of indicting LaRouche began at that time. literally while that summit was going on, at which Gorbachev demanded that Reagan give up the SDI, and in that case they could have an arms control treaty. Reagan wouldn't give it up, and in fact, only a year later, and this only after LaRouche himself had been indicted, and the prosecutions of him were already underway, only then, in September of 1987, would the Soviet leadership, Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership, agree to sign the, they thought it was safe, to sign the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. And LaRouche, in effect, by propelling this new doctrine and forcing it out and also developing its implications for a technological revolution and the spread of that technological revolution to the developing countries, as he was making clear there, he had effectively put the Soviet Union in a very difficult position because they were not going along with it, one which led to, as they admitted later, one in which the SDI led to the demise of the Soviet Union, in the estimate of a number of its own senior officials at that time. That was not his objective. His objective was peace. LaRouche's objective was peace and international economic and technological development for the Third World, in particular, a durable peace. Here is a paper that he wrote just about 9 months after that speech that you just saw on what the basis for a stable relationship between the two superpowers could be.
So we have a video broadcast of that, Mr. LaRouche, in his own words, reading the introduction of this draft memorandum.
On March 30th of this year, Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche published the document he intends to present to the Soviet government within hours after his inauguration as President of the United States. That document was circulated around key places in Washington and other places in the world, and was later published in the April 17th issue of the international news weekly, the Executive Intelligence Review. In his prefatory note to that draft memorandum, LaRouche wrote,
"Essentially, strategy is not a military question, but a political and economic question. When politics and economics fail to avoid war, military means adequate to such a purpose must bring matters as quickly as possible to a peace defined in political and economic, not military terms. Thus, the strategic military policy of the United States toward the Soviet Union must be a military extension of a peace policy, must be an instrument for establishing those political and economic policy relations between the powers which serve as the basis for durable peace."
The key to all 7 articles of the LaRouche Doctrine is contained in Article 1.
The political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress, to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations often classed as developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Insofar as the United States and Soviet Union acknowledge the progress of the productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interests of each and both, the two powers are bound to that degree and in that way by a common interest. This is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice, indispensable to the fostering of durable peace between those two powers.
Now that was he just stated there absolutely clearly the purpose for which he devised the the mutually assured survival doctrine idea based on these new beam technologies, the way in which he pursued it, the effect that it had, that idea of durable peace. Now that is what LaRouche's legacy is, and his exoneration at this point would make exactly this kind of policy available, accessible to many millions of people. But right now, it is exactly that kind of durable peace that Helga LaRouche is campaigning for in all of the work that she has done over the last 30 years in essentially creating the basis on which the Belt and Road Initiative of China eventually emerged, as starting from the Eurasian land bridges that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche campaigned for 30 years ago. This kind of potential cooperation in calling for the United States to join in the new Silk Road process, and for, above all, those two economic superpowers now, China and the United States, above all, for those two to cooperate both in their own economic development and in bringing infrastructure and productivity and development to developing nations. That's the basis for getting out of this extremely serious threat of war that we began with, the threat of, in fact, of all-out nuclear war. She has also begun to discuss that in trips to Russia with members of the leadership in Russia now. The President and President Putin and President Trump just met a couple of hours ago in Osaka in Japan, and they met on strategic subjects, but underlying this must be exactly this kind of economic and technological and, in fact, scientific revolution which can be brought to the development of the world, and that includes, obviously, joint exploration of space, above all, among the United States, Russia, China, India, the other really rapidly advancing space power. So it's the same durable peace for which Helga LaRouche is now leading the campaign internationally, and for the sake of which Lyndon LaRouche needs to be exonerated. As I indicated, here we also see the actual reason for his prosecution in the first place in the 1980s.
So as we speak, obviously these talks are ongoing in Japan at the G20, and we have yet to receive full reports on what President Putin and President Trump discussed in their talks. And then coming up tomorrow, we expect that President Xi and President Trump will be having their talks. But in the context of what Lyndon LaRouche laid out in that draft memorandum in the 1980s, what he continued to insist for the next 30 years, that it's these great powers, the four powers which he named as Russia, China, India, and the United States as superpowers, who can come together to change the strategic architecture of the planet and to create an entirely new economic architecture on this foundation. So obviously this is a very timely subject matter, and this is what we intend to continue to focus on as we continue through this weekend with the G20 summit in Japan, and then coming out of that as well. So I would insist that if you have not yet seen the feature documentary that LaRouchePAC published on the case for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, that you view that. The link is available in the description to this video. And also a feature historical background item on the history of Lyndon LaRouche's SDI, which was produced several years ago by LaRouchePAC, but remains extremely relevant today to continue to understand more about the details of what Paul laid out in this discussion today. So thank you very much, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching LaRouchePAC.com, and please stay tuned.